Hello and welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Kukulkan. Today I wanted to address the subject of grief and the process that we encounter when coming to terms with loss in our lives. This will lead to the concept of embracing death as an ally so that we can live more fully. Grief is generally associated with death. However, it's more accurately the process that we experience in coming to terms with significant loss, be it the death of somebody we have close attachments to, a relationship ending, an unforeseen change in occupation, moving home, illness, or coming to terms with outmoded physical, emotional, and psychological stages of development during our lifespan. Although coming to terms with loss throughout the process of grief is generally painful, it can also ultimately lead us into states of gratitude, acceptance, humility, appreciation, beauty, and a place where we may glean spiritual insight. Different cultures have various responses that are deemed acceptable as well as taboos when dealing with grief and loss. In some cultures, it's more permissible to outwardly express catharsis in an external manner, whilst in other cultures, the grief can be a very solitary experience. Masculine and feminine genders also generally have different responses that are deemed socially permissible. Sometimes we may have not learned how to grieve well. It may not have been something that was role modeled, discussed, taught, or assisted with during younger development. And this may have resulted due to a lack of support when we needed somebody bigger to hold us safe throughout that process, helping to answer questions and keeping us safe so that understanding and acceptance about the grief experience could be developed. In the study of grief, there have been several well-recognized models of the grieving process that have been identified that I have personally found very helpful to understand. One of the most well-known is that recognized by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as the 5 stages of grief. And in this model, the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Each of these stages has specific symptoms associated with it, and it's not a linear process of transition through each stage, but rather a dynamic and fluctuating process. Another understanding of the grief process is identified as the dual process model of grief. And this model recognizes that throughout the grief process, there are periods where a person must give attention to the loss that they've encountered, reflecting upon previous experiences, as well as periods of time where attention is redirected to moving forward. And the dual process is one that oscillates between loss and restoration as deconstruction and reconstruction of personal identity in light of the new life circumstances is navigated through. Developing hope and meaning are 2 major factors of importance in coming to terms with loss. To develop hope for the future, we need to be able to reorganize our relationship to the past. Although we can analytically look at the studies of grief, an experiential encounter with loss is a very personal process, and it needs time, care, attention, and perspective. Although coming to terms with a loss may have an initially acute period, throughout our lives there'll always be periods of reflection where attention is given to these significant events in our lives and how impactful they've been on our identity, our sense of selves. Grief is a process, and like any initiation, once the process has been initiated, we then need to move through it on a journey of self-discovery as we find out who we are now in relation to this loss. Throughout this process, our sense of ourselves, our self-identity is brought into question. Throughout the phases of the grief process, it is common for doubt to enter about many elements of life, and often questioning occurs about our relationship with God, Source, or a higher power as we ponder questions of why these events have happened in our lives. There often tends to be a certain degree of liberation that comes from an experience that we cannot control, whereby we're forced to surrender to the process of a ceremonial death dance. In my counseling practice, it is truly humbling to experience the revelations that clients often have about their own relationship to a sense of a higher power that comes from unfolding processes of grief. From the deepest pain regularly arises the recognition of a co-creation and the transformation of loss into a gift that opens the heart to truly appreciate and have gratitude for that which is of most value and importance. With counseling clients, I'm also regularly identifying events that occurred for them that did not have enough attention given to them to fully process the loss that the individual experienced. A lot of this may be attributed to understanding the effects of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, referred to as CPTSD. It is important to learn how to grieve well, to overcome the trauma responses that threaten personal security that we may have been conditioned with during early childhood encounters with loss. Later in life, it may also be an important process of recovery to grieve for the parts of ourselves that went missing earlier in life due to the trauma of loss that was overwhelming and not processed well. When we have not learned how to grieve well, it often results in repeatedly encountering the same pattern within relationship dynamics based on previous programming or behavioral conditioning. The shock that may be encountered with a loss often emotionally disturbs us and triggers our attachment model responses, throwing us into an emotional flashback where we may cycle or loop in thoughts, feelings, and behavioral responses that have been neurologically wired during earlier stages of development. One of the reasons that I have such respect for the process of grief is that from my own personal encounters with loss, I have also found them to be immensely powerful catalysts for spiritual development, whereby the veils between the worlds become quite thin. Grief may well provide a portal to an expanded sense of identity and a relationship with a sense of a mystical power beyond our everyday awareness. In a sense, an encounter with death, grief, or loss may provide a glimpse into the great mystery. One of my literary mentors, the godfather of Western shamanism, Carlos Castaneda, was probably the first to introduce me to the concept of regarding death as an ally. In a state of humility that may arise from having developed this relationship with loss, we may be able to more fully hear, sense, and be with our higher self-wisdom. As I have mentioned briefly in earlier presentations, there were periods in my earlier life that I had a great degree of fear and anxiety about the death process. Some of this was the result of anesthetic trauma from an operation on my leg that occurred when I was 5, which I'll discuss more in a future presentation on complex post-traumatic stress disorder. When I stopped drinking alcohol at 19 years old, I had so much anxiety that for over a year, every day I dwelled on the belief that my death was imminent, and it was the source of many panic attacks for me. It's been my experience that anxiety, be it related to death or otherwise, is generally like the analogy of an iceberg, where we only see the tip of the iceberg above the water whilst the vast majority of it is below the surface. And in this respect, the feelings associated with anxiety are generally only the tip of a greater world of subconscious emotions. I don't know that we ever fully resolve the anxiety around death. However, experiences that people describe as spiritual encounters often provide a great sense of peace, acceptance, and that there's something beyond death, that life is an eternal continuum without beginning or end. Certainly my own encounters with grief and experiences of shamanic death and rebirth have all provided glimpses beyond the veil that have allowed for more sense of acceptance of the guidance of a higher source that we're all intimately connected to. Having a sense of your spiritual identity or relationship with the higher self certainly may provide a sense of reassurance throughout a period of transition associated with loss and grief. Coming to an awareness or perhaps a sense of faith in this higher power helps in developing the recognition that things have a way of working out when we trust the process of this higher power. That perspective can have us transform tragedies into blessings in disguise. One experience of non-ordinary reality that I had several years ago occurred when I had the blessing of living with a close friend whose mother was dying whilst living on the same property as us. Although she had become progressively unwell for some time, one night several weeks before her passing was a particularly defining turning point in her progression. That evening, I noticed the ambulance pull up to take my friend and his mother to the hospital, and a few hours later, not long before I was going to bed, I noticed them arrive home from the hospital. I lay down in my bed in preparation for sleep, and I began to sense that I was having a panic attack. And after a while, I sensed that I was really unwell and my body was feeling clumsy, and I began thinking to myself, oh no, this can't be happening on the same night my buddy's needed to take his mum to hospital. Like, I can't ask him to take me to the hospital as well. And so eventually I got up, decided to smudge myself with some sage and take some deep breaths, and when I did, I began to realize that it wasn't my anxiety or experience that I was encountering, and that rather, whilst I was on the border of conscious awareness whilst drifting into sleep, my consciousness had merged with that of his mother's, and she was beginning her transition of expansion beyond the limitations of her body. And this was the beginning of several weeks of witnessing my friend nurse his mother through the ceremonial portal of death. His mother had been a palliative care nurse for 20 years, and during this ceremonial dance, my friend described his sense of merging on another dimension with his mother's higher self, and as a result, it was as though he had been downloaded with her lifetime of experience of dealing with patients in the palliative care process. That experience was very humbling for me and taught me a lot. Anyway, as always, I hope that you may have taken something of value away from this presentation and can use it on your own journey. If you wish to continue with more episodes of Future Self Dreaming, please hit the subscribe button. Information on booking counselling sessions and workshops can be found via the website futureselfdreaming.com, and you can follow Future Self Dreaming on Instagram and Facebook, as well as on YouTube. Thank you, in Lakesh.